Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with Jen Bentley, the Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
Well, thanks, Fred, and glad we could have an Iowa native back on our podcast here today.
Exactly. We have Derek Nolan from the University of Illinois Dairy Education and Extension. He helps dairy producers reach their goals by providing tools to make informed management decisions and improve milk quality. He focuses on providing hands-on experiences that help producers better understand the dairy cow and dairy production. Today, we'll talk about strategies that lower somatic cell counts and reduce the incidence of mastitis. Dr. Nolan, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. As an old farm kid from Northeast Iowa and an Iowa State alum, it's really exciting to get the opportunity to come back and give back to the great Iowa dairy industry and be a part of an official ISU program. I'm pretty excited.
We've continued to see an annual decrease in somatic cells in the central market of the Midwest area that includes Iowa over the past 20 years with seasonal patterns. How are producers defining or identifying that mastitis is a problem in their herds?
I think that's a good question where it's really beginning to change where, our farms are continuing to get better and better. And I think they're always looking for new ways to help manage their somatic cell count, what they can do and what data they can collect to help them, determine if there's a problem. I think depending on the situations, there's multiple ways in how this has changed. We now do more tests we can do more tests with a bulk tank to get a better idea of what's going on at the herd level. See a lot of farms continuing with DHI testing and those monthly tests, which I think are important because we get a little more information at the cow level, and we can determine if we're seeing specific trends throughout our herd. And there's newer tests that are inline tests. We've seen a lot of, especially with robots now and some of the inline tests we get. I think some of the initial research, there was a concern on how accurate some of these tests were. But I think the most important thing with any of the tests is that we get a baseline for the farm that the technology's on before we use some of the newer information to make those management decisions. With those inline tests or those cow site tests, we can get those at every milking. And I think a lot of the farms that are really on top of things are analyzing that data and that information pretty regularly, almost to the point of some of these inline tests that you can get at every milking. I don't know if we need to analyze every milking, but the ability to do it more frequently, I think, is really led to that decrease we've seen over the last 20 years. And farms have really done a nice job at educating themselves of how they can use the information to make proper management decisions.
Certainly, Derek, the tools that are given to us now, we could almost get into information overload, right?
Yeah.
We have so much data that we can look, and it's just, how do we break that down from actually looking at the cow to looking at records to what the information or the computer is telling us is happening with the animal. In your latest webinar, you kind of use this analogy or this graph analogy with the business intelligence and analytics graph, and I guess you replicated it to troubleshooting mastitis. And I kind of feel like that plays very well with all this information that we get. So walk us through that graph analogy.
Yeah, so I have to be honest, I stole at least the business analytics proportion from my major professor at the University of Kentucky when I was in graduate school. But I did adopt it, and made the change to how we can use that analogy for milk quality. And in the kind of the background of the graph is the more information a business collects and the ways they analyze the information, the more competitive they are in their marketplace. The analogy has a list of questions that, with the more information you collect, hopefully the more information, the more you can answer the question or answer more questions. And I think when we look at milk quality on farm, we often stop at the questions of how many cases of mastitis we have, clinical or subclinical, how often we see it, and is there a specific group of cows? And sometimes we don't go that far, but is there a specific group of cows we can determine have an increase in cases of mastitis? I think that the problem with stopping there is that is all after we have encountered a mastitis problem. We're trying to answer these questions after we have a mastitis problem. If we can answer other questions like why some of these mastitis cases occur, what is actually the root cause of the problem, we can curtail the problem and maybe catch a mastitis problem before it starts. One way we can do that is the use of on-farm culturing or some kind of culturing to help answer some of those additional questions and help these mastitis problems or catch these mastitis problems before they start. By being able to answer as many questions as we can when it comes to milk quality, hopefully it leads to higher quality milk on our farm.
We've just got done talking about all the data collection points we've got in today's modern dairies, but let's kind of break it down. Producers seeing a trend line change, what's the first thing they need to do to address or to get deep into that troubleshooting?
Yeah, a lot of it I think comes down to those base questions. I mean, we talked about by using some technologies or culturing, we can answer more questions and collect more information, and that shows a huge benefit. But I think it gets back to can we answer at least how many cases of mastitis do we have, or what is our current somatic cell count, and mainly how has that changed? And we can collect it with DHI data. We hope to collect it every month, but tracking the change I think is really important in how we start troubleshooting the problem, and having specific thresholds and goals associated with the information we're collecting to determine when we might have a problem. And I think that has to be farm specific. Some farms are going to measure it through somatic cell counts. Other farms might measure it through their cases of clinical mastitis. But by starting the troubleshooting problem, we first have to collect a little baseline of information and determine how that baseline has changed. And then I think depending on the information that we're collecting, then that leads us to the further steps we can take into starting the troubleshooting process. So for example, with DHIA data, our somatic cell count has changed this last month. What has changed maybe throughout our management practice the last month? Have we adopted a new management practice? Has the cow's environment changed? Right now, at least in central Illinois, it's pretty wet, and it's been a pretty wet spring so far. How has that changed how we've managed the cow's environment? Are we able to cope with the wet environment and continue to provide a clean, dry space for those cows to rest in? So with that, asking those questions helps us start the troubleshooting process.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Derek. Kind of looking at the cow side of things, and then looking at those DHI records. I know previous to my extension career, I was working on a dairy, and you'd get those DHI sheets back every month, and first thing we do is look at the hot sheet, right? So see who's high that month. Where were they previously? Where are they in their days in milk, that type of thing. And then from there, we would start CMTing those cows to identify, okay, is it all 4 quarters? Are they high in 1 quarter? That process of elimination, but then taking it to the next step of culturing. And so at least the farm that I worked at, we didn't do any on-farm culturing. We basically sent it to the lab and got our results back that way. But if a producer was looking at, starting on-farm culturing, what would be be their next steps? And do you find producers doing much on-farm culturing, or is it mostly sent to the lab?
I think we see a mix of both. And I think we get caught up, even myself sometimes, saying, adopting on-farm culturing is really important. But if you can build a really strong relationship with your veterinary clinic, or your clinic has the ability to do some of the culturing for you, at least if the farm can collect milk samples and then send them to the clinic, I mean, that's a great relationship to have and a great start. And then if we want to go the on-farm culturing route and do things on farm, I think there's a few considerations that we need to make. And the one is, do we have the proper space to set up some kind of culturing, just for the sake of terms, call it an on-farm lab? When we're collecting a milk sample for culturing, we need to do it aseptically. So we're not including any bacteria besides what bacteria might be in the milk. But when we're plating the milk too, we also need to make that consideration. So the place where our incubator is and the place where we're going to transfer the milk from the collection tube to the plate also needs to be really clean. So do we have a space like that on farm where we can make that work? I think the other, obviously, cost is part of it. I've had farms that have had great success with an old incubator for around $50, and some farms that, some of the higher end incubators can cost $500. And then the cost per culture, the last time I've looked and ordered supplies, is probably going to be around somewhere between $3 and $4 per culture. Do you have the space? Can you make the potential cost work? I think the other biggest thing that should be considered is, are you going to be able to interpret the results, and will you use the results to make a management decision or a treatment decision? If we're just culturing to determine what bacteria type we have in the herd, maybe the best thing to do in that scenario is just have a great working relationship with our veterinarian. If we want to make our treatment decisions based on our culture results, then on-farm culturing may be better suited for us, because we can get the turnaround a lot faster. Usually with on-farm culturing, we can have results in about 24 hours. But the important thing there is, are we able to interpret the results correctly? And I think it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. I've showed in some of the presentations and in the webinar, I still use a cheat sheet to help me determine specific bacteria types and how, the best thing we can do to manage those. Looking at the plates and being able to determine what the potential bacteria growth is on the plate, again, that takes a little bit of practice. So giving yourself time. I've seen a lot of farms that have adopted on-farm culturing still work with their veterinarian pretty closely, and maybe have the veterinarian run the sample as well, just to ensure that they're interpreting their results correctly to start, before they make any treatment decisions or many management changes.
Yeah, I think either way that you do it, Derek, having that, like you said, that relationship with your veterinarian, I always found, after we've done some culturing, that just having that relationship to be able to talk to your veterinarian, it kind of opens up the communication lines as far as what else is going on the farm, right? So it gets you kind of troubleshooting in different areas of the barn and the bedding and what's going on in the milking parlor. So it just opens up a whole another conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, not all the time are we culturing just to make a treatment decision. We are culturing too to determine, what else, other management changes or environmental changes should we be considering as well. That's a great point.
Let's follow up on that. What other management practices or troubleshoots should producers be looking at besides cultures to identify continuation of mastitis in the herd? What's all out there that they should be paying attention to?
Yeah, as we indicated, from a culture result, we hope to at least be able to determine whether or not the bacteria we're dealing with is environmental or contagious. And from there, then we can add in, helping and adding in some of these scorings, I think is really important. T10 scoring gives us a little more information on the quality of products we're using, such as our disinfectants. Is that causing any damage to the teat? But also, T10 scoring also provides information on, is our milking parlor operating as it should? Is our vacuum set correctly? Is our pulsation rate set correctly? And I don't think we think about enough is, if we change liners, if we change any small changes that we make in the parlor can affect our vacuum or our pulsation rates. And those need to be specific to the inflation or the liner or any other changes to the parlor. Udder hygiene scoring, I think, is important because it gives us a little more information on how well we're managing the cow's environment. If our cows are coming in dirty all the time, there's a good chance we need to revisit our management changes or our management decisions when it comes to how the cow's environment is managed. Teat-end scoring and udder hygiene scoring, I think we should score pretty, somewhat regularly. We don't want to wait till there's a problem. So we have a mastitis problem before we start adding these scores into our management decisions. So how often we do some of these scores, I think should be farm specific. I know parlor throughput is really important. We don't want to slow things down too much in the parlor. So maybe only teat scoring, certain groups of cows, such as our fresh cows, and then, cows around peak milk to determine how those scores have changed within those first 90 to 100 days, I think is important. Starting by scoring at least specific milking groups of cows, I think is a great way to start, but also having a representative group. So if I have if I have 3 different milking groups, maybe score 20% of the cows in each milking group. That way I'm not scoring everybody, but I'm at least getting a representative sample of not only the herd, but the group themselves. Another thing we can do is really important is just to ensure that we're maintaining our milking equipment and have a proper maintenance schedule with our milking equipment provider and service provider to ensure that our equipment's running like it should. Because if it's not, if our vacuum's wrong or our pulsation rate is wrong, we could potentially be doing damage to the teat end there. One other, and there are companies out there, we have one here at the university too, that enables us to do milking time records to ensure that milking equipment is functioning as it should throughout the whole milking process. The one reason I like those is because it also helps us look for bimodal milkings. So did the cow just milk out of the gland cistern and teat cistern, or did we actually wait for proper milk letdown before we put the milking unit on? By looking for those bimodal milkings, it might give us an indication of whether or not our timing of our milking procedures is correct, or if those cows are coming into to a stressful environment and don't want to let their milk down. Both of those are going to lead to extended milkings where we may be doing a little more damage to the teat end than we need to.
I know this is maybe parochial, but I think it's worth saying to follow up on your comment, to step back and see what changes. It still boils down to people who are milking the cows. You've got to supervise them. If you've got new employees, make sure that they have been trained on the protocols you have in place. And even some of the guys who've been in that pit a long time, it's not a bad idea to remind them and say, let's talk about the pre and the post protocols we have for this particular parlor.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then just to add to that too, I think when going through any training procedure or retraining, I think the most important things to do, and the milking labor has always been kind of a passion of mine too. And what we have found out in working with other extension agents is the milkers want to know why the procedures are important. So when we're doing our training or our retraining, explaining why the use of the pre-dip is important and why the post-dip may be different and why the timing of the milk procedures is important. I think that goes a long way into ensuring that, or hopefully ensuring that, it goes a long way into ensuring that the people that are milking are taking the care because now they understand why things are important.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of people handling our cows. And I would say also we're seeing a lot more automation in the milking world right now. And
Mhm.
even within automation, there's times where you have to troubleshoot those too, right? Because sometimes those sprayers don't automatically spray where they're supposed to too. So taking some time to observe, is a T-tip getting covered on those cows? Are those milkers properly milking the cow out? So there's still some of that, like you said, milking maintenance that has to happen with that too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we were working on an extension study where we did observe some of that. And yeah, just like the robot and the automated milking systems are great because most of the time they treat the cow the same every time. But sometimes those tend to drift too, where a cow comes in from a different lactation, parts of the mammary gland have changed. Retraining the robot to ensure teat dip coverage is proper. Yeah, I completely agree. That's very important.
So Derek, working with Midwest dairy herds and working with probably tighter and tighter margins in the dairy industry, is managing milk quality worth cost and investment? I think you've done some studies that look at some of those investments into milk quality and the types of returns that we see on that. So you want to talk further on that?
I always, when first talking about managing milk quality on the farm and the cost of managing milk quality on the farm, there's one paper that was done in the early 90s that has shown that the best way to look at the cost of managing milk quality, for example, or mastitis, is to actually try and calculate first how much that disease is costing you total on the farm. And what the research that paper specifically has shown is that you can break the cost of a disease up into two parts, either the losses or the expenses. The losses, so for mastitis, is mainly going to be loss of potential milk production and potential loss of premiums. And then our expenses are everything, not only the antibiotics, but the cost of bedding, the cost of training and retraining labor on milking procedures. All of these come into the cost of pre-dip and post-dip. Those are all expenses that we have to prevent mastitis on the farm. And that paper has shown that in the three that they looked at, the really important thing is when you adopt a management practice, you adopt it correctly. Because if we don't adopt a management practice correctly, now we have the cost of that management practice, but we're not seeing the benefit of decreased losses due to mastitis. So we have the same or maybe a little less losses, but we have that whole cost of the expense. So if we're going to adopt a management practice, make sure we're adopting the management practice correctly. And the other thing is, as we talked about earlier, the farms that we work with and the farms out there are seemingly always continuing to get better. Some farms that we work with are at 200,000 and they want to know if they can economically get to 150,000. In some cases, that can be feasible. You need to think about milk price at the time. The higher the milk price, the more valuable the milk is. Adopting things at a higher milk price can be beneficial. But the one thing that we've looked at is the use of premiums. If you are a farm or a farm that you're working with is receiving premiums for somatic cell count, the potential economic benefit that they can receive from reaching that new premium structure should be thought of as an investment into milk quality for the farm. So if I'm currently at 250,000, but I get a quarter more 100 weight, if I get to 200,000, I do just quick table math to see with the milk I'm producing now, what's that additional quarter worth to me over the milk that I'm producing. And I should think of that as an investment. And can I invest that money to reach that new milk quality premium or that lower milk quality premium? And those farms that are we found that are right on the cusp of being able to reach that premium, most of the time that pays off. Milk price and whether or not you're receiving a premium, I think are really important when trying to determine, is it feasible to adopt or to change a management practice.
Dr. Nolan, thanks for all the great information you shared today. And as we conclude, any last take-home messages you want to share with our listeners?
The biggest thing is try to keep things as farm specific as possible. Each farm has different milk quality goals. It's always easy to compare ourselves to our neighbor, but if we're trying to determine our own thresholds and where those need to be, trying to be as specific to our farm as possible is really important. And again, I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity. And as I said, as a former Cyclone and a dairy kid from Northeast Iowa, it's been a lot of fun to come back and give back to the extension program.
I'd like to remind our listeners that the webinar you presented will be posted on our Extension Dairy Team website, and we'll include the link with this podcast for those listeners who want to see it again and gain a bit more in-depth interpretation of the information. I'd like to thank you and thank the listeners for joining us today, and I look forward to visiting with them on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.